Scripting for the Web, WS300, Platt College. Dates, Math, and Objects. This is just one way to create a new date. The date object by default holds today's current date and time. You can think of the code here as creating a variable called today that holds a number. This is because in JavaScript, dates are stored as numbers, which is the number of milliseconds from January 1st, 1970 at midnight until now. January 1st, 1970 at midnight UTC is referred to as the Unix epoch. Early Unix engineers picked that date arbitrarily because they needed to set a uniform date for the start of time, and New Year's Day 1970 seemed to be the most convenient. UTC stands for Coordinated Universal Time, which really should be Universal Time Coordinate to match the acronym used. Please note that the current date and time value in JavaScript is determined by your computer's clock. The purpose of the date object is to let you work with dates and time. That would be years, months, days, hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Dates can be output as a string, such as this one, Friday, May 8, 2015, 8:15, 43 seconds, GMT, Pacific Daylight Time, or as a number. This number is the value of milliseconds from January 1st, 1970 at midnight until Friday, May 8, 2015, 8:15, 43 seconds, GMT, Pacific Daylight Time. There are multiple ways to create a date object. We can see here the default, which captures the time on the local computer, setting a date based on the number of milliseconds from January 1st, 1970, setting a date by passing a date string, such as October 13th, 2014, 11:13:00, or setting a date based off of the values that comprise a date, year, month, day, etc., from largest to smallest, from year to milliseconds. It is important to note that date objects, once generated, are static. Only with JavaScript and a timer event like setInterval can we update them. Also note the keyword new. Whenever you see the keyword new, it is an indication that something new is being created. We instantiate, or another way to put that is create a new instance of an object, variable D1. This gets the local time on the computer. For D2, the date is created based off of the number of milliseconds from epoch time. For D3, the date is created on something more like what we are used to writing for a date. In the last version, the date object takes the arguments and values largest to smallest and is created that way. These are some date methods. Time is now is storing the default date value, which is what time it is on your computer. Get full year does exactly that, gets the full year. So this year is 2021, and that is the value it would return. Get month returns a value of 0 to 11. January is 0, February is 1, March is 2. The month value is 1 less than how we would write it normally. Feel free to complain and you'll get sympathy from me, but it won't do you any good. Can't change it, just gotta live with it. Get date returns the day of the month. So as of today's recording, that is the 9th. Get day is the day of the week. The values returned are 0 through 6, with Sunday being 0 and Monday then carries the value of 1. Same kind of idea as the month situation. Get hours, get minutes, get seconds. All of these relate to the current time. Hours are in military time, so midnight is the 0 hour. 5 p.m. is 17. Get time gets the value of the date in milliseconds from epoch or Unix time. There are lots more methods found at the W3 schools and the Mozilla Developer Network. Some other methods to mention are to date string, will display the date in the following format: Mon.Og09/2021. To time string will display the time 16:45:53 GMT minus 0700 Pacific Daylight Time. Like so much in JavaScript, you can get values and you can set values. Setting your values for hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds is one way that you can clear out any additional time so that you can compare whole days to whole days when doing a countdown, for example. We will probably also use the set hours method so that we can test our programming against the hours without having to wait or reset the time on our computers. The above example comes from the W3 schools. Since dates are stored as a numeric value, that is, the number of milliseconds from epoch time to the date set in the date object, we can compare values easily, like the example seen here. When we talk about math, we got to talk a little bit about numbers. We've already covered numbers briefly on the first day when we talked about data types, but you need to know that until ES6, JavaScript had a single type for all numbers, and it treats all of them as floating point numbers. However, the decimal point is not displayed if there are no digits afterwards. Internally, JavaScript engines optimize and do distinguish between floating point numbers and integers, but that is something that programmers don't see. JavaScript numbers are double 64-bit values based on the IEEE standard for floating point arithmetic, IEEE 754. That standard is used by many programming languages. In addition to being able to represent floating point numbers, the number type has three symbolic values: positive infinity, negative infinity, and nan, standing for not a number. Non-integers are less precise. A more recent addition to JavaScript is big int, which lets you represent integers that may be very large. There are caveats to using big int, however. For example, you cannot mix and match big int and number values in the same operation, and you can't use the math object with big int values. We will not be using big int in this class. So with the explanation of numbers out of the way, the math object allows us to perform math on numbers. Here we can see some methods used on the math object. A minor correction on math.random. It returns a decimal value from 0 to almost 1. It never gets to 1. We can use math.random for randomization in our games. Math.min returns the lowest value in a set of numbers. Math.max returns the highest value. The rounding methods are the same as in your math class. You can remember ceil stands for ceiling and floor, well, is floor. One rounds up and the other rounds down. Easy to remember when you think of where the floor and the ceiling are relative to you. There's lots more methods like sine and cosine, tan and atan, and the value of pi is also available to us by using math.pi, where the p and the I are capitalized. This is an example of an object literal. This comes from an example we did in the Dragonflight game. As I mentioned before, objects have properties. This object has the following properties: up, down, left, and right. These store the values of true or false based on which arrow keys are pressed, so that we can determine which way the user wants to move the character of the Dragonflight game. We can use the key down event to know when the user is pressing the key, and the key up event to determine when the user no longer wants to go that direction. By referencing the object by its name, in this case dir, dir, we can simply set its property with dot syntax, like you see in dir.up equals true. The key code for the up arrow is 38. When the up arrow is pressed, we have the indication that the user wants to move the character upwards. Therefore, we would want to set the value to true. This kind of format is what we typically see in JSON or JavaScript object notation. It is the only way that we can have key value pairs in JavaScript because JavaScript arrays only have indexes. Some other languages, like PHP, allow for arrays that have key value pairs. That is why I mention it here. And it is for this reason that JSON is used rather than an associative array. We'll get more into JSON when we talk about AJAX. This example comes directly from Day 2 slides examples where we talked about logic. The capitalization of person shows that this is a constructor. The date is a constructor, so it is instantiated with the keyword new. In this case, our constructor is a custom object that we made. We can create our own object templates and assign the properties and values when we create them. In the world of games, this is a great way to create a type of object called enemy, and each enemy could have different values in their properties. I don't plan to cover that in this class, but it is an important concept, especially when you start utilizing classes and class inheritance. This has become more and more popular in ES6 as classes didn't exist in JavaScript before then, but other languages like PHP use them and have always used them. As I mentioned before, with plain JavaScript we can get and set properties with dot syntax. An HTML object is created when a browser interprets HTML and a document object model is created and stored in memory. We've seen times when we've selected an element with JavaScript and then set a property like text content, style.background color, or other such thing. A quick reminder, you can tell the difference between a property and a method if there are parentheses. Methods are functions that are specifically tied to a type of object. They are actions that an object can perform or an action that can be performed on that object. Remember the example of my coffee mug. It does not receive phone calls, and my phone does not take well to holding coffee. Different objects take different methods, and different objects have different properties. Even within the realm of HTML, different elements are useful for different things and therefore have different attributes and properties. For example, an image tag does not have an inner HTML property, and a div will not have a source attribute. Different objects in HTML have different purposes, so while they are all HTML objects, JS does differentiate between these types. If you ever select an element and use the .constructor property to see what kind of an object it is, the value returned will specify the element, such as HTML div object or HTML image object, and so forth. Here are some examples of getting and setting HTML object properties with plain JavaScript. Here are some examples of getting and setting HTML object properties with the jQuery library. Remember, when we use the jQuery selector, we create a jQuery object. If we store that object into a variable, then we have access to that object and can use jQuery methods on that object, as we see here. The primary difference between getting and setting values is if we pass an argument between the parentheses. The advantage here is that the syntax is more consistent. In summary, the date object needs the keyword new. Custom JavaScript objects can be made and always need the keyword new when creating a new instance of that item. If you need multiple objects that do similar things, you may want to consider creating a custom object. A custom object would have to be made and referenced by using a constructor. Constructors for objects should be capitalized so that you can see that they are special types of objects to maintain syntax consistency. HTML elements by their nature are objects. Objects can have their property values accessed or set with JavaScript. Math is a part of the global object and can be accessed whenever and wherever by just using the word math with a capital M. I hope that this talk has been informative and enlightening, and I'll see you in class.